My father hated many things. He hated so many things, he actually kept a list of all the people and things that he hated. And he was not shy about voicing his opinion. But my dad also loved a lot of things. Standing here, several months after his untimely death, at the way too early age of 69, if I had to think about the person he loved the most, I think that would be my mom. But if I think about the things he loved the most, phones and anniversaries. And I think the reason he loved phones so much is because he let him connect to people and commemorate their anniversaries. Now, for my dad, an anniversary was way more than weddings and birthdays, though clearly played an important role. For my dad, an anniversary was a commemoration of just about anything. For example, he would call me every year and he would remind me of my first night on call as a doctor. And around the year, I would always get phone calls from him to remind me of my wife and my kids' Gregorian calendar birthday, but lest I forget their Jewish calendar birthday as well. And when his anniversary came up with my mom, there was always something spectacular lined up. My dad loved anniversaries. He lived for anniversaries. My dad was a salesman, an insurance salesman to be precise. Started selling insurance when he was 16 years of age. He got kicked out of high school one day and showed up to work the very next day at my grandfather's agency. And yeah, he remembered his own work anniversary. This was Mexico City in the 1960s, where he cut his teeth. He literally knocked on the doors, walked down the hallways, drove up and down the city, building up a client list that would eventually become a pretty impressive insurance agency. And it was during this time, I gather, that my dad came up to one of the biggest realizations of his life. If he was going to make a living doing this, he was going to have to be way, way more than just an insurance salesman. He was going to have to be there present for his clients every step of the way. When I was young, he would sometimes take me on these rides around the city to meet his clients. We would scamper around the city, and he would always magically find the parking spot that was closest to the client's home or office. We would walk in, make some quick chit-chat, and he would review whatever policies needed to be reviewed. And before leaving, he would smoothly pull out his pocketbook and just make sure that he had all of the client's anniversaries lined up correctly. And that's how he developed a system. So every morning, he would make 1, 2, 3 phone calls to wish his clients well. And he would not miss a single one. The more he did it, the better he got at it. And mind you, this is before Facebook was a thing. And it was a wonder to behold. My mom tells me he got so good at this that that some couples would actually depend on him to remind them of their own wedding anniversaries. He was that good. Growing up, I have so many memories of my dad. He was connected to a phone all the time, either those rotary phones or remember those ginormous bricks of first-generation cell phones, flip phones, smartphones. He had a phone on him all the time. By the time I was a teenager, I realized that he had this down to an art form. Those phone calls in the morning, they were perfectly timed to make sure you got the person at home, but that was not horribly obstructive. He would deliver a quick greeting and then the smoothest of heartfelt greetings. By the time he would hang up, you would think that even the phone felt warm and toasty. And he did this every single day, on weekends, on vacation, every single day. And people loved him for this. Many years later, when some business decisions didn't go his way, it was exactly these phone calls that helped him rebuild his business and put my sister and me through college. But for me, this fascination never really trickled down to me. For me, a birthday was a great reason to grab drinks with my friends. An anniversary, a wonderful reason to grab a drink with my wife. But for my dad, it was clearly much more than this. And as he got older, his wedding list became a little bit darker. When one of the partners would die, he would still call up the surviving spouse, and you could hear that these phone calls were a little bit longer, a little melancholic, maybe even a little painful. When both of the parties passed away, he would still call the surviving children, and you could hear him suffer along with a memory. It was around this time in his life where he decided he needed a hobby. So the hobby he picked was to start up a gentleman's club. Not that kind of gentleman's club. His gentleman's club was in a huge conference room, and it was for older gentlemen. He had a huge table lined up, and he had big plush chairs, a couple of waiters, and several dozen members would come in weekly to listen to an invited speaker. He would have an industrialist or a politician or a scientist come, and they would talk about whatever they had to talk about, and then coffee and conversation would follow. He did this for many, many years, and he would, of course, keep a list of all his members. But his members were older gentlemen, and older gentlemen do what older gentlemen tend to do, which is pass away. And with each death, a morbid new anniversary would enter his book. He would sometimes call me and say, "Hey, Jack, do you remember Mr. So-and-so?" I would not, and he would get upset. "Jack, what do you mean? Mr. So-and-so, that older gentleman with the white hair, walked with a cane." "Oh," I would answer tongue-in-cheek, "that white-haired gentleman that walked with a cane." He would not find that amusing. "Anyway, Jack, he passed away last night." "Sorry to hear that, Dad," I would answer half-heartedly. "But Uncle such and such, he's still doing okay, right?" I'm needling him at this point. My uncle died many, many years before. But my dad, silence. "Jack, that uncle, he died like 5 years ago." "No!" I would cry out in faux anguish as my dad would add me to his list of people he hated. Then he would move on and we would talk about whatever we were talking about. When I would hang up the phone, my wife would tell me that it wasn't nice to do that to my dad. It wasn't nice to mock him like that. And looking back, I think she's at least partially right. For my dad, these phone calls were sacred. And I had absolutely no right to mock him. But somewhere deep inside, I knew there was something weird with his fascination with phone calls. Later on, he got older, his health took a turn for the worse. He continued making these phone calls day in and day out. But it was around this time that I realized that these phone calls were no longer a reason to reach out to clients, and were no longer a reason to touch base with friends. For him, these phone calls had become a reminder, a fucking daily reminder of his mortality, of our mortality, once, twice, 3 times a day. When his health took an even worse turn for the worse, and he did not reach out for medical care, each phone call was just a reminder of the limited time he had on this planet. And he did not take this well. What once had been an amicable grouch became an unbearable bastard. What once had been a curmudgeon with a list of funny complaints now became an old man yelling at life. What once had been celebration of life phone calls now became another excuse to suffer at his own approaching fate. I flew back to Mexico one time. He invited me to give a talk at his gentleman's club. And that morning, before going, I realized something was really wrong. Those phone calls that he made, still making them, but they were no longer smooth, far from it. He might have been talking with a client, he might have been talking with a friend. Either way, it was clearly painful for both parties. He huffed on the phone. He complained that the person didn't answer quickly enough or that he had to leave a voice message. And then he would hang up with a clatter and turn to me in disgust, arguing about whatever the other person was doing or how upset he was. By the time I made it to his gentleman's club, we arrived, but the large conference room, that was gone. Now we were relegated to a small little back room. There were a few fold-out tables, some uncomfortable seats, and maybe about 5 really, really old men sitting around. They snacked on some snack food on paper plates as I gave my talk. I gave the best talk that I could, something sciencey, something medical. My dad was very proud of me. He told me so as we were coming out, and those words meant a lot to me, but I just could not be happy. I could not shake the feeling of collapse. Everything that my dad had built just collapsed. Sure, some of the members he had, yes, they passed away, but had he chased some of them away? This was not the way it was supposed to go, but it was the way my dad chose to go. Those bridges he built, the camaraderie he cultivated, those beautiful relationships, personal and professional. He torched every single last one of them. It was so bad that as I flew back, I was very much afraid that when he would pass away, that nobody would make it to his funeral. When the fateful day arrived, I flew back to Mexico City, got into a car, drove with my mom to the cemetery. The tradition in our community is for the burial, the eulogy, and the funeral all to take place in the same location. We arrived early, and we said our private goodbyes. Against the tradition of our community of burying our dead with only the most modest of clothing, I even managed to sneak in his phone into the casket without anybody noticing. He would have been proud. And then we waited outside under a large canopy that was protecting us from the Mexican sun. His best friend was to my side, and a few of my best friends were on my other side. And we waited. The scheduled time arrived. There were maybe a handful of us around. 5, 10 minutes passed. A few family members trickled in. Maybe about 15, 20 minutes later, Mexican time, if you will, a few dozen people showed up, and then a few dozen more. And this is when I realized that all his phone calls, years and decades of phone calls, had not been in vain. Very soon, there were hundreds upon hundreds of people there to pay respects to my dad, in the shade and in the sun. It was my responsibility as the oldest child to give the eulogy, which I will briefly share with you today. We are here to put to rest my father, Sammy Rubinstein. He was not a perfect man, and his last years were particularly difficult for all of us. I am not here to sugarcoat it. I am not here to tell you what to think of my dad. What I am here to ask is you remember the phone call that you received every year. Remember how nice it felt that he was usually the first one to remember. And this year, when that phone call does not arrive, I ask you to please think of my dad and remember how nice it feels to be remembered. Thank you.